Yes.
Yes. All right. Okay, so I know this month's theme has been naked and vulnerability, but tonight I was challenged to take a different route with the information and the content. So tonight we're going to play 21 questions. It's what you play when you want to get to know somebody on a date, when you're meeting new people, or just to learn more about people that you already know. But tonight, these 21 questions are going to be about our particular subject, which is oversharing. So oversharing is a relatively new word, but it's an ancient concept. The act of telling too much to too many people or to the wrong people at the worst times, it seems to be a natural occurrence. The advent of social media has normalized oversharing, and few people actually understand the complexity and nuance of circumstance and context when allowing outsiders into their space. So, what we used to call somebody who talked too much in the 90s, now they're an influencer, even if they only have a handful of people to influence. Telling the world where we live, eat, shop, worship, attend school, our daily routines and activities, where our kids go to school, what they're wearing, what their nicknames are, who picks them up in the afternoon. These things are almost normal and they sound harmless, but what happens when we share these things with people who lack good intentions? When that happens, the information that we've shared, it transforms into vulnerabilities that can be used in whatever ways other people deem necessary, even if those ways aren't favorable to us. So think about the string of robberies a year, maybe 2 years ago in Atlanta that targeted reality stars, or pre-pandemic and early pandemic, all the social media personalities who were being stalked and followed home. They were barely escaping assault. These sound like worst case scenarios, but these examples are to, solidify the point that oversharing is not only a hindrance, but it's dangerous sometimes. Merriam-Webster defines oversharing as a revelation of too much information. It's a really simple verb, and it's one of the simplest definitions I have ever seen come out of a dictionary. At one point in time, the biggest offenders of oversharing were small children who lacked discernment about what to say and when, and then elderly people who lost their inhibitions, and then they lacked care about appropriateness of what they say and when they say it and to whom they say it. Discernment, inhibition, and concern are all components that are missing in these two groups. And for all intents and purposes, they're not supposed to have them. In the case of small children, appropriateness is learned. And for elderly people who may deal with forms of dementia, grace needs to be given. So, what happens, or what should we be thinking about knowledgeable adults who should know better when they're the culprits of bad behavior that we know as oversharing? Scripture shows us Samson, who told the wrong thing to the wrong person. And now we've recently had a lesson on Samson, so I'm not going to do a deep dive into Samson and who he was and all that he did. This evening, I really just want to focus on his ultimate undoing, which is his relationship with Delilah. So we're going to look at Judges 16:4, and we're going to see where Samson went a little bit wrong. So it says, after this, Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah who lived in the valley of Sorek. The Philistine rulers went to Delilah and said, find out what makes Samson so strong. Trick him into telling you how we can overpower him and tie him up and capture him. If you do this, each one of us will give you 28 pounds of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, tell me why you're so strong. How can someone tie you up and capture you? Samson answered, someone would have to tie me up with 7 new bowstrings that have not been dried. Then I would be as weak as any other man. The Philistine rulers brought Delilah 7 new bowstrings that hadn't been dried, and she tied Samson with them. Some men were hiding in another room. Delilah said to him, Samson, the Philistines are here. But Samson broke the bowstrings like pieces of burned string. So the Philistines didn't find out the secret to Samson's strength. So that's going to be one of our first questions, which is, why do they need to know? Why do people actually need to know? Most people in this section look at Samson's escape, but I want to dig into Delilah's questions, particularly why would Samson's loving companion ask him how he could be harmed? Now, we know the answer to this was the payout from the Philistine rulers, but why wasn't Samson questioning Delilah? Why wasn't he more curious of her reasoning and her rationale? Yes, love is blind and lust can make you an invalid, but Delilah's question, her acting out scenarios that could potentially ruin Samson, the ambush, her distress at being wrong and unable to harm Samson, all of them should have been dead giveaways for him to remove himself from the situation. Not to mention, this happened 3 more times. So in our lives, we have to be mindful of the people who inquire about our information. We have to question their motives. When we're asked questions, a good first response is, why do you need to know? I know it sounds a little rude, but determining somebody's motives is important when you're being asked important information. Any person acting in good faith should not have issues with sharing their motives. And any person acting deceitfully or with ill intent, they may have a little bit of trouble responding to your question. Now, I want us to take a second for a quick little reality check. So let's make this relatable, okay? How many times do we get on social media and we see questions like, what did you nickname your car? Or who was your third grade teacher? Or what was your home address when you were 5 years old? We see those pretty often, don't we? So do you comment under these posts and give them honest answers? You can answer in the chat, you can raise your hand, or you can just keep that to yourself because this is going somewhere. If you have ever answered those questions and answered them honestly, have you ever asked yourself why somebody would be curious about such specific information about your past? Those questions are the same as the security questions that your bank, your car insurers, your student loan lenders, and anybody else who's important needs to use to identify you. And so when you're answering those questions, people who IT enthusiasts would call bad actors, they're mining your responses for the purposes of identity theft and financial fraud. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not because it happens every day. People's information that they have freely given away on Al Gore's internet is used against them daily. It's on social media, via text messages, via emails. So I do want us all to be reminded to be hyper vigilant. That's a means of protection on Beyonce's internet. And we need to remember, that everything is not to be shared with everybody. All right. So back to the lesson. Now we need to ask ourselves why we feel the need to share, okay? So getting back to Samson, after Delilah questioned Samson about his strength, he responded to her with a lie. Remember, this happened at least 3 times in the beginning, and he lied to her every single time. So did Samson actually have to lie to Delilah? Couldn't he have told her that it was none of her business or said something else to end the conversation? Now, we know that Samson's actions served a purpose to fulfill his role as a judge. So these queries about Samson can be seen as rhetorical, but it's also fair to ask why he needed to give answers at all. And the same thing can be asked for us. Why do we need to share with other people? Why do we need to tell other people anything or other things? What's the benefit of telling what we know to people when we're speaking in a given moment? In Samson's case, we can surmise that he felt a little bit bulletproof before there were bullets. He had never been overtaken. He'd always had his strength. As a Nazarite, there were several rules that he'd broken. He actually broke all of them except for cutting his hair. It's fair to say that a touch of arrogance can present itself to an undefeated fighter like Samson. It's hard to feel fear when you've never seen defeat. And with his riddles and acts of vengeance throughout his adult life, it's fair to say that he knew what he could get away with. How many times are we so sure of ourselves, so confident in our abilities, that we decide we can move forward however we want to and say and do whatever we want to? Another theory about Samson's retorts to Delilah is that without ever seeing defeat or a threat that he couldn't conquer, Samson may have acted out of naivete. So think about babies who lack fear because they've never experienced danger and they don't understand it. Samson could have been similar. He could have lacked understanding of his circumstances, which allowed him to respond as he did. His false sense of security and the thought that he couldn't be defeated disarmed him. And after continuous nagging, continuous whining, Delilah finally got Samson to tell her the pure, unadulterated truth. So verses 16 and 17 say, she kept bothering Samson about his secret day after day until he felt like he was going to die. So he told her everything. He said, I've never had my hair cut because I've been set apart to God as a Nazarite since I was born. If someone shaved my head, I would lose my strength and be as weak as any other man. And with that confession, Samson relinquished his power and compromised his relationship with God. Delilah shaved his head. God left Samson, and the Philistines overtook him. They gouged his eyes and enslaved him, and Samson later died in Philistine captivity. So that leads us to our next question. What to do when I've shared too much? Now, Samson's death, I want to dig into that a little bit because it wasn't just as simple as him dying alone, blind in a prison cell. Samson actually sought God in prayer one final time, requesting a miracle that God would grant. His death was a suicide mission to liberate Israel, but also to avenge himself. He killed the most powerful men of Philistia, more than he'd killed throughout his lifetime. And Samson is, in fact, listed among Israel's judges and the men of faith named in Hebrews 11. Now, when we overshare, sometimes the prognosis looks bleak for us too. Like Samson, we have to face the consequences of what we said. But we can take a note from Samson's playbook. He realized who provided his strength and he called on God in prayer. We can do the same thing. After our mistakes, we often see ourselves as screw ups. We see ourselves through a negative lens, and then that allows us or causes us to create distance between ourselves and God. But God doesn't want our distance. He desires closeness with us. So even in our folly and bad decision making, our providential, omnipotent God, he can fix our situations. So when we've betrayed trust, or when we've shared the wrong thing or talked to the wrong person, or our timing was terrible, we can call God. Now, that does not mean he's going to smooth everything over and fix it. He might, because he can. Or he may choose to let us see the error of our ways so that we can correct ourselves in the future. So that's up to God how he handles it. But I also want us to look at, and I'm not going to dig into these verses just for the sake of time because these are chapters that I'm talking about. James 3 tells us about the power of the tongue and its ability to rule our bodies. He likens it to the rudder of a ship or to the bit in a horse's mouth. Little tongue, big body, a lot of control. Really hard to tame. And in the Old Testament, there are scriptures that are filled with commentary on wisdom and discernment. And I'm calling out Job 28 and the whole book of Proverbs because I think everybody should read them at some point in time. They are filled with information about wisdom, wisdom's characteristics, and how she may be sought after, found, and heeded. So then we come to ask ourselves how we can choose wisdom, because wisdom is what we need to have in order to be a little bit more judicious about what we share. So if we do decide to choose wisdom, we may adopt some strategies that prevent ourselves from oversharing. We can think. We can ask ourselves if what we're about to say is true, helpful, inspirational, necessary, and kind. If the answer is no, then you should probably steer away from the conversation you're having or from the remark that you're about to make. You can also plan ahead and think about how the listener could use your information. Think about the worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario? Is it something that you want to come to fruition? How will your life be impacted? How will your loved ones be impacted? If you play that scenario out fully and you don't like how it plays out, then you need to stop talking or you need to change the topic. Another thing is when someone is asking for information, kind of like Delilah, when they are pressing hard and asking you repeatedly, question their eagerness. An elderly lady that I went to church with when I was a kid, Sister Thames, she would quickly abandon her plans if she deemed anybody too eager to assist her. Now, whatever your intentions were, her safety was paramount. And she trusted a lot of people because she was, I think Sister Thames may have been 100 or older than 100. We don't actually know her age, but she was dependent on people. She couldn't drive for herself. She had to depend on other people for a lot of things. But she didn't gamble with her gut instinct, and she didn't gamble with other people's behaviors. So take a note from an elderly old lady in South Carolina who pretty much said, if your intentions or if my gut just feels off, if your intentions feel off, I'm gonna leave you right there. Another thing is when somebody wants to know something that's none of their business or is detrimental to you, you have the right to just say no. Now, no is a complete sentence, and regardless of how your listener receives that no, that ends the conversation right there. Another thing that you can do in choosing wisdom is to keep a journal. It's so simple, but it's true. You can keep a journal, write down the things that you're eager to share with other people in that private space, and then walk away from it. If you see that same passage in 24 hours and you still feel that tugging, pulling feeling, that nagging feeling that you need to share it, then do it, share it. But likely you won't, and you'll have saved yourself from expending some unnecessary energy. So these are only a couple of the tools that can help us to be mindful about the words that we speak, but they are not all inclusive. You have to be aware of your triggers and the things that can cause you to share information that people haven't asked for and that people don't need to know. Now, if you can't seem to identify your triggers, you need to pray. You need to ask God to reveal them to you. And then once you do identify your why, pray about that. Ask God to help you to overcome your struggles. And then when you're faced with situations in the future, pray some more, but also ask questions. You don't have to ask them out loud, but literally ask questions. Make sure to figure out why and how you should handle the situation in a more judicious and discerning way. Remember that a moment of lapse judgment produced negative results for Stanton, and that it doesn't have to be that way for you. You have the advantage of learning from past mistakes so that you could avoid future ones. And that should help you to avoid going overboard with the information that you share. That's my lesson, guys. Thank you for listening.